The compounding interest of the legend company for David before birth would have manufactured the compounded 7 layers or more of the estimate of the 800 billion per layer estimate for the sales and distributions, which would have already been traded and normalized to his accounts under the position of them justifying the sale of balancing their credit balance. At which point you have the manufactured position of David's starting assets from the obstructed targeted communities, which would have put David with, from birth, full management of butlers and maids at the highest level of life and affluence, as living in mansions would be the functional minimum. Higher luxury living as a minimum amenity for human decency is the status quo obligation, and any reduction from that is a criminal reduction of human decency, at which point charting the differences creates the definition of the margins of their liability from their injury. Any amenity or luxury that he would have enjoyed would have been owed to him, and thus taking it away is a criminal act of theft, such as in the takings clause, which requires them to pay fair price, which is market price, which would have an insured guaranteed number attached to it, so that they couldn't fuck with the actual material pricing because it would be a set price. And the material of this system would have put David around actors and supermodels from the very beginning as a status quo obligation, as the need for necessary force being an obligation of those who are compelling the uh, initiation of force does not have an obligation on the target, but is an obligation of those using force, at which point the restraints of reasonable or necessary compels them to engage in a market price exceeding the contract value for the engagement of having David's attention, at which point the already compounded 7 layers of the economy under David's system for his wealth would have had to have been exceeded, normalize the minimal position of the supermodels around David who are negotiating the act of the normal customs and cultures and policies from the perspective of those who are historically under threat by the rapists. Now, the actresses and models being historically threatened by the rapists, such as with the casting couches, etc., would actively have encouraged their own position of having solved the threat by exceeding the terrorist threat from the rapists to their superior boss. And David being over Hollywood and many of the specific entertainment functions for those professions would be the highest ranking boss. So Boss Baby is the savior against the rapist for those parties. And every obstruction of that contract is a changing of the power dynamics, which is a conceding of the power to the rapist, which is aiding and abetting the rape as a rape culture in the sales and distribution of permits for those rapes, giving a seal of approval and cooperation as having the approval of the general community for it to have occurred. Manufacturing these types of revolts compound exponentially over the exponential amount of time, which materializes our understanding of the alternative markets based culture on the basis of what would have been negotiated by the supermodels and the actresses, such as Jolie, who was estimated to been promoted under their need to have acquired the value, to have had the rejection hotline dating system, at which point the active negotiations for David's dating schedule would have actively been filled through these systems, as he would have been promoted by the highest level members of female value in the world, at least in the country, from his ability to perceive it. At which point you have to understand the expansion of the international arrangements through the treaties with David's estimated country would have drawn the higher level first world countries' attention, which would have drawn many of the inferior grade countries' attention, which would have compounded the highest value potential women in the world to this position for that arranged position, completely filling out and creating a surplus crowd with an exponential line behind it for those dating life opportunities as a minimum human decency standard of life, which generates our necessary obligation of understanding the position of status as compared to the defamatory reduction of human decency for the defamation. So the act of holding David is an act of defamation. Now, these systems project the position that Jolie would have been called um, in order to assist in the treaty with Cambodia, which was projected to have still been a trip, at which point it would have had to have upgraded from a nonsense excuse to exist into a functional treaty with an economic backing, at which point the economic treating and support economy, which would have been generated from this arrangement, would have at least, at a minimum, been starting off with 1,000 non-talented, non uh, non-educated baseline workers, low-level minimum wage workers being the expectation, at least starting at the 1,000, would have compounded exponentially into the investment into the education system for that time, which would have had David advance education funds for those who would have been forming the top ranked management positions instead of the agents, which would be temporarily there while waiting for the education to finish, allowing for the cycle to finish processing in its entirety and normalizing the upper caste sections of that part of the economy until it would normalize into the treaty and its full diverse opportunities, um, based on whatever thing they would actually settle on in the treaty, which tells you the arrangements in that system as not substantively changing from the otherwise understood estimate for that part of the market, at which point it's a question of what they actually needed for the services, and that having the historic position of knowing the insurance market from the American targeted communities means most of these policies would have been thoroughly ironed out by the time that that would have become significant, facilitated David's bonds over those, easily covering any potential risk as it has already been a settled market, which overlaps into the position of the United States Intelligence Oversight Systems, which has observed military functions such as the intelligence functions, which is an extension of the military, manufacturing the rape culture, which is the system of aiding and abetting in those rapes, which, having systematically been arranged by the power dynamics of superior offices and the extortion of intentionally limiting opportunities to the inferior, creates inferior options for the targeted groups in order to be extorted, which is the normalization of the rapes, which manufacture their compliance and acceleration of being approved on their co-conspiracy into the rape culture, generating the feminist incorporated system, which allows for the feminists to actively subvert the political identity of women as active haters of women in favor of the white nationalist men who hate women, which, being subverted by the intelligence oversight law enforcement function of the military police from David's branch, would have actively retaliated in proportion to how much they felt threatened by the engagement of competent law enforcement against their crimes, such as their rape schemes. So the more they're a rapist, the more they hate David, at which point these systems would have compounded exponentially throughout the system, including the normalization and false legalization through a custom without reason of senators being able to do rapes and it not affecting anything, which functionally would be challenged, which makes those senators elected by the Confederate voter fraud specifically threatened by the existence of David. So the act of him existing puts them in danger of being arrested and punished under law, which they have systematically acquired the position under the agreements and certifications and exchanges, giving them permission to auto permission on the rate permit structure. Now, all of this would have been exponentially compounded over the insurance market structure, which is in active subversion by risk management systems, which allows each party to systematically train each member of the community under the assertion of the common threats and the mechanisms of weaknesses, which would have actively reinforced the military position of David's education to the rehabilitation centers, which assumes a non-fault rehabilitation uh, projection. So the remedy doesn't blame the person who is suffering from the injury. Um, so if they have some kind of social defect or addiction, then it doesn't really blame them. It's only interested in the active remedy, including restoring them to the normal functions of society, such as their contract schedules, allowing them to rehabilitate their lives in an equitable, competent way, normalizing their stable civility without the social engineers' subversion into catastrophic antisocial um, collapsing of the social structure, which generates the weakness derived by the intended KKK communism enforced as an infliction against its victims in the targeted communities. Women historically finding themselves into positions of power within the insurance structure would actively be promoted into their education system of getting high grade um, PhD structures for their education as a minimum obligation of their existence in the general society, which facilitates them as maintained higher status members of society, which everyone else would have to obey or functionally work around, as they are the ones controlling and manipulating the definition of the credit scores and prices. So the prices of the insurance and the returns and etc. is based upon the bonus credit score, which is actively collaborating with their insurance scores, which facilitates a total obligation for any participant in society to actively collaborate with the standard customs and policies of that arrangement in order to sustain themselves inside society from the insurance market point of view. And with women in power actively maintaining the home and its various effects, you have men who are historically engaged in the position of harder work, such as the security and risk specifically arranged for that, actively incorporating themselves into the government, law enforcement, and military, etc., under these positions, which manufactures the position of them coming home as functional in quote security mechanisms such as the butlers and chaperones, which would actively be an aspect of attaching themselves to the insurance structure as alternative employment for the arrangement of the normalized society in its security against the risk, such as the risk normalized with inside the arbitrary threat of society generating arbitrary criminals, minimizing it to the least amount possible under a cultural position. And while some of it will arbitrarily be reproduced genetically, without it being specifically connected to a genetic line, as to not promote genetic guilt, you would assert the ability to stop the incredibly reduced crime rate from that point of view. From this record, it also includes the military intelligence oversight function, which has solved the Nazi plot from using the white nationalists in the United States to eventually engage in a military action of the Nazis, collapsing the United States by the Confederate white power, generating their ability to invade Israel, which was projected to be protected by David, subverting the assault. which is the basis of the war on David, seeking to turn him into the Antichrist by ritual.